Please turn over to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6 is where we're going to be getting our lesson this morning. But before we get into that, we'd like to say welcome. We are excited. We know that there's a lot of people not able to be out, a lot of people not able to be with us, but those who we are able to be here, it is a good thing. Those who have the opportunity and the ability, we have technologies now so that they can watch it from home. Now, let's hope that doesn't become what we replace services with, because it does not replace it. It doesn't even stand up to what being together does, but I'm not going to get into that because I'm sure Mike will next week. So we're not going to get into that. That's not my lesson. As you can see up here, there's a whole bunch of dogs doing stuff as their owner tells them to. And as I thought about what I wanted to speak on for this week, I thought, man, I really like it when my dogs sit when I tell them, lay down, come, all that good stuff. And then I thought about, yesterday, I thought about Wednesday, earlier this week when I had my little tiny thing. I thought about it, I was like, the doctor gave me this whole big long list of stuff that this is what you need to do. Don't lift stuff up. Do you know how hard it is to not lift up your children? That is really hard to do. All this stuff. Don't lift heavy things. Don't move around. Stay still. Make sure you're icing the area. All this stuff that they tell me I'm supposed to do. Make sure I'm taking my medicine, which, by the way, I'm not good at doing. So all this stuff. I thought, why are they telling me to do this? And it's interesting because they care about me, right? Maybe they don't have an invested interest in caring about me personally, but they care and they want to make sure that I don't hurt myself. We as parents do the same thing. We want our children to grow up and be good children, but we want them to not get hurt, right? So what do we do when it comes to our children? We tell them don't touch things that are hot. We want them to obey that. We tell them don't run in the parking lot, hold my hand. Why? Not because we're trying to be like, oh, you're mine. We do it because we want them to not get run over by a car. Or even in the store. In today's age, there's a lot of people, stealing kids. So we want to make sure we always know where they are. Why? Because we love them. We're going to look at that in a little bit later too. You see, what we're going to talk about this morning is this obedience. If that is obedience that we have to our doctors where we're doing what they tell us to make sure we don't get hurt. Or if that's obedience we have for our children, making sure they obey us so they don't get hurt. Or if it's obedience because it just makes having a dog that much easier. Whatever it might be. Having obedience is a good thing. This morning I want to look at obedience, but looking at it with Daniel. As we've been looking at different characteristical traits of individuals in the Scripture, this morning we're going to use Daniel. I ask you to turn over to Daniel chapter 6. Let's read these first 10 verses here. Understand there is a lot more to Daniel's life than these 10 verses. But we're going to look at these 10 verses, and this is where we're going to get the majority of our lesson. Beginning in verse 1, it says, "It pleased Darius," remember, this is who Daniel is now serving. He had served Nebuchadnezzar. He had served Belshazzar, right? Now he is serving King Darius. It says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. And this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and the satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful. Nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, 'We shall not find any charge against this Daniel, unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God.' So these governors and satraps thronged before the king, and thus said to him, 'King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators, the satraps, the counselors, the advisors, have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree, that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter.' Therefore King Darius signed the written decree. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room with the windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before God, as was his custom since early days." we look at Daniel, we can look at a lot of courage he has in doing what he knew was right. But as we look at obedience that Daniel has, we're going to look at it in a few different ways. One, we're going to look at the obedience that Daniel has towards God. We're also, though, going to look at the obedience that Daniel has towards the law of man. And lastly, we're going to look at the law of man versus the law of God and using Daniel's example for that. So as we begin looking at obedience to the law, talking about having obedience unto God, that's not really something that's going to be new to us, is it? We know that we are to have obedience unto God, but what I want to really look at this morning is found there in verse 3. Found there in verse 3 of Daniel chapter 6, then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because... This is telling us how he was able to distinguish himself, which we're going to look at here in just a moment as well. But because an excellent spirit was in him. Understand something when it's talking about this spirit here. This is talking about Daniel's spirit. Some people say, well, no, God was guiding him. No, that's not how this was working at the time. Daniel would pray to God. God would give him a vision, and he would tell him what the dreams were about. But right now what we look at is Daniel's individual spirit. That's what it's actually referencing here. So when we see Daniel's spirit, what we see about him is this. Daniel's spirit, and I'm sorry that's a capital S. It happened when I was typing. Please ignore that. But Daniel's spirit was this. It was temperate. It was seeing things clearly. It was not controlled by his emotions. Why is that so important for us to recognize? Because when we see how Daniel was able to do this, how Daniel was able to have this spirit, it's referenced and it's told to us again when we look into the New Testament, that we are to have this same type of spirit. This spirit that is temperate. This spirit that sees things clearly, that's not controlled by emotions. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, it says, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Why does it tell us to be sober? Here specifically it's telling us because it doesn't want our mind to be clouded. This is not telling us to not get drunk. That's not what this verse is talking about. What this verse is talking about is keeping a clear mind, being able to see things clearly, because the devil is out there to get us. But when we talk about seeing things clearly, keeping a clear mind, that goes to our judgments as well. And it goes to our judgments. If you turn over, sorry, I shouldn't have done that. If you turn over to Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2, verse 12. There it says, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in the present age. Once again, it's telling us keep our mind clear. Don't let things outside affect our decisions. Don't let things outside affect the way we see things, affect the way we behave, affect the way we are to be obedient unto God. Now, what type of things? You see, we're not talking about substances that some use. So what types of things might actually affect us? Well, what about our anger? If we let a situation get the best of us and we become angry at a situation, angry at something going on, are we really going to have the best outcome with our obedience? No. Why? Because we're letting our own emotions, our own desires affect how we respond. Instead of turning to the law of God, instead of turning to the Bible and saying, what does the Bible tell me how to respond? Or what about if we have jealousies, envy, strife? Any of these things, you look and you say, well, those are things the Bible clearly tells us to stay away from, right? Well, let's look at something else. What about sympathies? What about empathies? See, these are things that we need to have. We need to be able to be sympathetic with people, but sometimes we need to make sure that sympathy doesn't affect the way that we obey God's law. What do I mean by that? See, there's something that I never thought would affect my life. And that was divorce and remarriage. I never thought it would be something that affected me or my family. But it did. It affected my little sister who was cheated on by her first husband. And she divorced him. But I think about that. I think what would have happened if that hadn't been the case? and they gotten divorced. I think, well, sometimes we see today where people start having sympathy for people. Oh, they were in a bad marriage. It was just wasn't a good way. He didn't treat her right. He was never home. So you know what? He needed to leave her, and it's not right for her to be alone anymore. I mean, she has all this going on. She needs somebody there with her. I think that it'll be okay. I feel, or I hope. And they start looking at all these other sympathies, and they're sympathetic to that person. That's not a bad thing. We can be sympathetic to a situation with the person and not let our obedience change. We can be sympathetic to a person and not let our obedience in what we teach and say, no, the Bible tells us this. We can teach the truth and still be sympathetic. But what we need to do is make sure that we don't let it cloud our judgment. You see, the obedience to the law of God that we need to make sure we're doing, it requires our spirit to be sober. It requires us to have a sound mind. You hear when you look at basketball games or football or whatever, and they talk about, a lot of times they think about the kicker. They say they have ice in their veins. They stay calm, cool, collected under any situation. We as Christians could actually learn a lot from that. Have ice in our veins. Calm, cool, and collected when situations arise, and we need to remain obedient unto the law. But when we're obedient unto the law, it allows for something else. It allows us to distinguish ourselves. You know, when we look at Daniel, we see that, and we look in Daniel chapter 6, verse 3 again. We're going to go back a little bit now. Daniel 6, verse 3 says, then this Daniel did what? Distinguished himself above the governors and satraps. It wasn't just that he stood out, that he was somebody who was remembered by King Darius. No, he set himself apart from the governors and satraps and counselors and all of those others. He set himself apart, distinguished himself, showed that he was different. See, when we're able to be obedient to the law, when we're able to do this, it will show that we are different than others. It will show that we are different than the world. Turn over to 1 John chapter 4. 1 John chapter 4, we're going to read verses 4 through 6. It says, you are of God, little children, and have overcome them. This is talking about the false teachers, the Antichrist, those things. It says, you are of God, little children, and have overcome them, because he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. They are of the world, therefore they speak as of the world, and the world hears them. Let's stop right there for just a second. Why does the world hear them? Because they're not distinguished differently from them, right? They're part of the world, so they hear them. But continue on here in verse 6. It says, we are of God, and he who knows God hears us. He who is not of God does not hear us. By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. We are to set ourselves apart. We are to distinguish ourselves. Show that we are different from the world. And we see this same thought echoed when we turn over to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, beginning in verse 17, and we'll read through chapter 7 and verse 1. It says, therefore come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you. I will be a father to you, and you shall be my sons and daughters, says the says the Lord Almighty. Chapter 7, verse 1. Therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness and of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Perfecting holiness. Does that mean that we're perfect? No. But it means that we're going to show that we are set apart. It means that we're going to show that we are different, that we are not of the world. Because you know what it means to be holy? I know I've talked about this before. It means we're set apart. If I ask a question or I make a statement, we can't be holy if we're no different than everybody else. We can't be set apart if we're trying to live like the world. We can't be set apart if we're not obeying God's law, if we're not trying to be a child of God, and if we're trying to be a part of what the world does. We cannot be holy. See, obedience is incredibly, incredibly important. Because not only do we distinguish ourselves in the world, we distinguish ourselves and we show ourselves before God. We show God that we want to be different. We show God that we want to be His child. But when we talk about this obedience, it leads us to rewards. It leads us to these things. What do I mean by that? Over in 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter speaking here, he says, "And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away." Who is he speaking to? The elders. But he tells them that there will be a crown of glory that does not fade away. Doesn't that sound like a reward? Doesn't that sound like something we can strive for? Or if we turn over to James chapter 1. James chapter 1 and verse 12. "Blessed is a man who endures temptation." Talk about obedience unto the law. Guess what? Our obedience will allow us to endure temptations. But it says, "Endures temptations, for he who has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love Him." This reward that is waiting for us. Or if we turn over to Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10. "For if we live faithfully unto death, we will what? Receive the crown of life." You see, when we talk about rewards, sometimes I hear people say, "Well, knowing you did the right thing, that was the reward." I don't agree. I don't agree. Because that all came from me. So I know what I did, so I reward myself. That doesn't make sense to me. But knowing that there is something that I'm running for, knowing that this race that I'm in today means that there's something waiting for me, that makes sense. That makes sense that there's a reward waiting for me. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. It says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it." That's why it doesn't make sense to me when I talk about a reward that's already within me. I know I did what was right, therefore that's my reward. What have I really obtained? It says, "And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty." That means he runs with a goal in mind. He knows what he's running towards. "Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself shall become disqualified." What does he mean when he says, "I discipline my body and bring it into subjection"? He means he keeps his mind sober. He means he keeps his mind clear so that he knows what he is doing. That way we're able to be obedient. You know, when we talk about being obedient to the law of God, like I said earlier, we understand that. We understand that we need to be obedient unto the law of God, but what about the law of man? See, this is something that I think we need to talk about today. Because we see a lot going on today. A lot of new ordinances put in place, a lot of new things changing in the world that we live in that we have gotten so used to. So what about these things that are going on? Well, let's look at Daniel again. Let's look at Daniel and look at his example. Daniel chapter 6, verse 4. So the governors and the satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. Let's stop right there. What kingdom are we talking about? Because it's not the kingdom of God. This was the kingdom of man. This was the kings, the foreign kings that David was serving. The foreign kingdoms, the foreign laws. These kings who served things like silver and gold and iron and wood, making gods of them. That's who Daniel's serving. We're talking about him obeying the laws of man. And yet what does it tell us? It says, "But they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful." They weren't able to find something to pin on him. It says, "Nor was there any error or fault found in him." You know, Daniel was able to overcome these things, was able to serve these laws. But why? Why was he able? And trust me, we're going to get to the law that he did break, the ordinance that he did break here in just a moment. But why was he able to do this? Why could they find no charge? Turn back to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, we're going to read verses 20 through 23. It says, Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changed the times and the season. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells in him. Excuse me. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's demand. This is Daniel thanking God for what God gave him. But what does he say? He says, you raise up kings. Daniel recognized that the authority didn't come from the kings. The authority wasn't the kings that it was doing, it was God's. It was God's authority that was here. We know that it's God's authority because when we turn over to Romans chapter 13, we see this. We see this where it tells us, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but the evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. Authority doesn't exist from man. It came from God. If we're talking about the governments, the police, law enforcement, whatever it might be, or if we're talking about parents, the authority the parents have over their children, that's not something that it's just because of me. That's authority that came from God. Or we talk about the authority that the elders have. That authority comes from God. We need to be reminded from time to time that the authority is not because some person was elected into office. The authority is because God gave it to them. But something that I thought about while I was studying this is we start saying things like, well, I don't like this law that man put into place. And right now we're going to talk a little bit about the masks, right? And I understand there are certain cases, certain situations where wearing a mask doesn't make sense for health reasons or whatever the case may be. There are situations like that, and I'm not trying to say there's not. Okay? Make that very clear right now. But when we start looking at these things and we start saying something like me and my mom talking about it, I'm so tired of wearing a mask everywhere I go. But guess what? That's something that was put in place. Does that mean that I want to? No. Does it mean that I want to keep 6 feet away from my brothers and sisters? No. But you know what? That's something that might actually be necessary. Because they're trying to help get this virus out of here. Make sure that we recognize this. Because when we start saying things like, well, I don't like it, therefore I'm not going to do it. And let's say we're talking about laws of man. How long until we look at the laws of God and say, you know what, I don't like that law either, so how long until we stop following Him? That's a fear I have. Because the more I see that we are not able to meet together, the more I see that we're not able to be here building one another up, the more I'm afraid that we're going to turn away from God. The more I'm afraid that our country is going to fall from God. I'll tell you right now, the power we have, that's because of God. But you know what? Let's talk about this laws versus man and law of man versus law of God. Because there are some states that are doing things where you can't worship. They're putting laws in place, keeping us from worshiping, keeping us from doing these types of things. But what does Daniel teach us about that too? Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. It says, "Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since earlier days." First of all, let's make something clear. Daniel knew the writing was signed. He didn't do this out of ignorance to the law or to the ordinance that was signed. He knew. Daniel made a decision knowing what was signed to say, no, I'm still going to serve God. No, I'm still going to go pray to God. But he knew there were consequences. And you know what? The same is going to go for us, but we'll look at that here in just a moment. We see that in verse 16, though, the consequence that Daniel had to go through. This secular, this earthly consequence. But we can see the same with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We're not going to turn there, but we know the story of them. They were told to bow down. They didn't bow down. They were cast in the fiery furnace. Even those who threw them in were consumed by the flame. Why? Because they knew that they were going to serve God. But let's turn over to the New Testament. Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5, verse 29. Here we look at Peter and the other apostles. And they had just been told by the chief priests that, "Did we not command you to no longer teach in this name?" And what do they tell him? They say, "But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than man." You know what? There might come a time when they say, you can't meet. You can't meet together. Guess what? That's not the government's decision. It's not. If I'm going to meet and I'm going to serve God and I'm going to preach the truth, that's what I want to do. Or if they come down and they say, you know what, we're going to say you're no longer allowed to sing in worship service because it puts more spit into the air. I'm going to sing in worship service. You know why? Because that's what God tells me to do. I'm going to pray. I'm going to preach the truth. We're going to teach the truth and make sure those know it. Because that's when we have to do it. We must obey God rather than men. We have to. But you know what? If it's not enough just to say this is what we have to do, well, let's talk about why. Why should we want to do this? Turn over to John chapter 14, verse 15. It's our final verse for this morning. John chapter 14, verse 15. Jesus says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." Such a simple thing Jesus says here, but it's so true for us. Why are we going to serve God? Why are we going to meet? Why are we going to sing praises unto Him? Why are we going to partake of the Lord's Supper? Because we love Him. That's what drives us. That's what should drive us in everything that we do.